I'm absolutely delighted to be here. You guys are having great weather. We're still having the tail end of winter in the wilds of Nebraska, which is where I hail from. And I'm right now wrapping up a book on Andrew Jackson and the War of 1812. So I'm delighted that Howard is here representing the Hermitage, and that I have a chance to visit a place that Jackson has a tie to. I think that World's Fair that swallowed up his office also was responsible for the loss of another 1812 relic. One of the two brigs that were involved in the Battle of Lake Erie, the USS Lawrence, was shipped to Philadelphia by rail for that World's Fair, and it was consumed in a fire. So it never made it back to Erie. So I don't think that World's Fair has been good to those of us interested in this war. I've chosen for my topic today the myths of the War of 1812, and I'm calling this What We Know That Ain't So, Myths of the War of 1812. The title, What We Know That Ain't So, is from a comment that has been variously attributed to Will Rogers and also Mark Twain. We're not quite sure who originated it, but it goes something like this. It's not what we don't know that causes problems for us. It's what we know that ain't so. In other words, those things that we don't question, that we don't do any research on, that we just accept, that's likely where we're going to run into problems. And it seems to me that aptly sort of captures the nature of the myths of the War of 1812. These are things that are widely accepted, and they ain't so. Now, this is, my first book was entitled The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict, and I still think it's more or less the forgotten conflict, although sometimes my friends who work on the Korean War say, no, ours is the forgotten conflict. Quit poaching here. But that seems to have caught on, and most people will describe this as a forgotten conflict. And since people know so little about the war, I think it's probably a good idea to give a summary of what this war was all about. And that's what that sort of long paragraph that leads this handout I gave you is all about, presenting an overview of the war. Now, I'll read this, you can read along with me, and then we'll move on, but just to ensure that we're all more or less on the same page. President James Madison issued a proclamation declaring war against Great Britain on June 19, 1812. The purpose of this war was to conquer Canada, but American militia armed with Kentucky rifles could not overcome the militia of Canada, who were aided by British regulars and by Indians under the command of Tecumseh, the leading native of the period. The U.S. Navy, relying on pit crews that were heavily British, employed large frigates that were actually ships of the line in disguise, and thus defeated the British in the war at sea. In the last great battle of the war, American riflemen defeated the British at New Orleans on January 8, 1815, although this battle was actually fought after the Treaty of Ghent had ended the war on December 24, 1814. If the British had prevailed at New Orleans, they planned to sack the city and retain Louisiana, which would have changed the course of American history. Federalists bitterly opposed the contest, which has aptly been called a second war of independence, and their opposition encouraged the enemy and prolonged the war. Had the United States adopted a more focused military strategy, it would have conquered Canada. But even without Canada, the new nation enjoyed enough success on land and at sea that it could still claim victory. Now, you may not agree with everything in that paragraph if you're a student of the War of 1812. It is my hope you don't agree with any of it. There is not a single statement in that paragraph that is true. It embodies, by my count, 20 of the myths and misconceptions of the War of 1812. And I will address what I consider some of the leading ones momentarily. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about myths and where they came from. Let's start with a definition. What is a myth? Well, the way I like to look at it is you have a spectrum of statements about the War of 1812, and at one end you have the really big myths, the big ideas. What caused the war? What was the role of the militia? Who won? And often these are issues that are still subject to debate. We may not have a clear-cut answer. But in my view, most of these myths involve some things that aren't true. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the little factual errors that I think any student who knows the subject well will concede is just plain not true. The notion, for example, that Jackson's line at New Orleans was made out of cotton bales. That's just not true. They tried to use cotton bales to anchor the gun platforms, but they were too flammable, so they were removed from the line before the main battle. Or the notion that the 93rd Scottish Regiment of Foot wore kilts at the Battle of New Orleans. And a lot of the imagery, the paintings that we've gotten out of the war will depict them that way, but they wore tartan trousers. Or the notion that that big flag, the Fort McHenry flag that's on display at the Smithsonian, actually flew over the fort during the British bombardment. Nah. They had a smaller storm flag that they ran up at night during the bombardment. And we actually have an eyewitness report of them running up the main flag, as they did every morning at 9 a.m. to the tune of Yankee Doodle. So those are at the other end of the spectrum. Those are just plain factual errors. Let's call them misconceptions of the War of 1812. Where do these myths come from? Well, a lot of them come from the participants. People misremember, misstate, misrepresent their experience in the war. And you have to remember that they used black powder in those days. And I figure within the first 5 minutes of the opening Invincible battle, nobody can see anything. And those Kentucky riflemen at the Battle of New Orleans, it was really artillery that did most of the damage there to the British. But those guys are just firing blindly. And we have some reports, a lot of them are just holding their weapons up over the line. I mean, they're not sticking their heads up there. But even if they could see, if they're at a lower portion of the line, I don't think they could see anything. It's all smoke. So they may not have a good idea of what really happened. And there is an old saw among military historians that if you ask two people who have been involved in a battle to describe it, it'll sound like they were involved in different battles. And my amendment to that is ask them the same question 20 years later, and it's going to sound like they were in different wars. Because those stories are going to evolve over time. This is where we get that notion that a story gains in the telling. And we've all had this experience, where you tell a story, maybe you have a little sidebar, a little minor point, and you make that point, and that just grabs your audience, they laugh, or they want to know more about it. Well, next time you tell a story, that becomes your punchline. So you have modified your story in response to your audience. And I think that happens a lot. So the participants, I think, were responsible, or have been responsible for a lot of our myths and misconceptions of the war. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, we had a lot of local, regional, and national boosters and patriots who wrote history. And this was an era in which legend and myth and patriotic stories sort of substituted for verifiable history. So a lot of these myths either were invented by these boosters, or they were picked up from contemporaries and maybe embellished on, or simply reproduced as they heard them in their histories. In addition, we get a fair amount of this mythology from serious historians, and I want to mention three in particular. We'll start with the great British naval historian, arguably the first modern naval historian. This was William James. He wrote a number of treatises that touched upon the War of 1812, and he was seeking patronage from the Royal Navy. And so he even tells us in a letter that he writes to a Royal Navy official, "In all my accounts, I've tried to make the Royal Navy look good." I mean, that was his job. And essentially what he did was he picked up a lot of myths from the losing naval captains in the war, the British naval captains trying to explain away why they got beat by American ships, and he would repeat these, and then they would be repeated in other naval histories, and to this day they occasionally show up. So William James wrote incredibly good history. I still use his work. There's stuff in his work you can't find anywhere else, but he also perpetuated a lot of the naval myths of the War of 1812. Next we have the American antiquarian Benson J Lossy. Lossy wrote a very successful book, a pictorial field book of the Revolutionary War. He was a sketch artist and a writer, so his books are just loaded with sketches. And he had such great success with his first book that he wrote one on the War of 1812, traveled about 10,000 miles in the 1850s and 60s, visited sites, talked to participants and observers. There were still plenty of people around who remembered the War of 1812, and then he sketched the sites as they existed in the 1850s. This is a real treasure trove of information on the War of 1812. Still extremely useful, valuable. I cite it on occasion because there's stuff there that I can't find anywhere else. But Lossy also repeated just about everything he heard. And so as a result, a lot of conventional wisdom that was not quite right got into his book. And finally, there's the great Henry Adams, arguably our first modern historian of the War of 1812. This is the fourth generation of that great Adams family in the 19th century. His great-grandfather was John Adams, second president, and then his grandfather was John Quincy Adams, who later served as president. I guess he was fifth. Henry Adams was the first scholar to look at archives on both sides of the Atlantic and write sort of history in the way that we write it today, trying to step back and write history based on mainly original resources. And I would say he wrote a 9-volume work on the history, on the administrations of Jefferson and Madison, published between 1889 and 1891. And I would say that was the standard work on the period up until probably the 1960s. And it has only been in the last 15 or 20 years that you don't see Adams cited quite so much anymore, because there's been so much new material published on the War of 1812. Adams, I would say probably 6 of his 9 volumes were devoted to either the cause of the war or the War of 1812. So arguably, this is a multi-volume treatise on the War of 1812. But there were 2 things that influenced Adams' presentation of history. Number one, this guy was one unhappy individual. Just absolutely unhappy. And he just took the most dyspeptic view of everything that happened. He's the only scholar that I know who tried to argue that everybody lost the War of 1812. Just a real negative view of things, and I think that influenced his history. Even more so was his family bias. Those Adamses made it their mission for 4 generations when they wrote history to do everything they could to make their ancestors look good. And Henry Adams was no exception, but he was a master at it. He never referred, for example, to John Adams. You get references to President Washington's successor or Mr. Jefferson's predecessor in the presidency. Or if he's referring to John Quincy Adams, who was a senator from Massachusetts, he will simply refer to him as a senator from Massachusetts. I'm not sure that he uses a family name anywhere in those 9 volumes. I ought to check on that to find out.
What made him unhappy?
What made him unhappy? God knows. What makes anyone unhappy? I think it was just, that's the way it was. I'll tell you, 4 generations of Adams had a common problem, and that was vanity. John Adams is very open about his own vanity, and it is a fear that someone somewhere is getting credit for something that you deserve the credit for. And John Adams is the only founding father who feuded with everyone, all the other great founders. Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and it was because of this vanity, this jealousy. Now, I'm not quite sure what Henry Adams' problem was, but God, he just had one of those real sour, negative views of life. He was a really unhappy guy. He was a master at sort of disguising his biases. And he would present his opinion as if it was conventional wisdom. Everyone today would agree that the Jay Treaty was a bad treaty. Well, number one, the Jay Treaty was a good treaty, and number one, not everybody today agrees that it was a bad treaty. But he would wrap these opinions in sort of conventional wisdom, and sometimes you dig into some of his statements, and he's trying to present as a fact something that is simply his opinion. But he was such a master of the language, he was very good at doing this. So I consider him fairly, his judgments fairly untrustworthy. And big surprise, guess who comes out the worst? The three people who come out the worst in his 9-volume history. Number one, the guy who defeated John Adams for the presidency. That was Thomas Jefferson. Number two, the guy who defeated John Quincy Adams when he sought re-election. That was Andrew Jackson. And number three, Timothy Pickering, a New England Federalist who broke with the Adamses. So you have to take Adams with a grain of salt, but to this day, there's a guy, that Gary Wills, or Willis, is it Wills or Willis? Wills, the popular historian, I think he's popular, although he's an academic, wrote a whole book on Adams' history and was completely oblivious to these biases. And we have a couple of articles. I don't know how he missed the articles on them that sort of laid out the case of the Adams family bias. One of them was called Blood is Thicker Than Irony, which is a great title. Anyway, those are the three scholars, I think, in the 19th century that helped perpetuate a lot of these myths. Myths are incredibly durable. When I told my buddy Don Graves, the great Canadian historian, that I was writing a book on the myths of the War of 1812, he said, well, I hope you figure out a way to drive a stake deep into the heart of those myths, because otherwise, like zombies or vampires, they're just going to pop right up again. And he was absolutely right. I published my book in 2006 on the myths of the war, and these myths still make it into modern treatments. So they're just very durable. And part of the reason they're durable is often they're part of an exciting story. What a great story to think that Kentucky riflemen defeated the veterans of the Peninsular War. In other words, that they defeated the conquerors of Europe.
The stories of Dolly Madison also a myth?
No, that one is true. Dolly Madison did indeed save a lot of White House treasures, including the portrait of Washington that's been attributed to Stuart, and she sacrificed her own personal property to do that. So she's a genuine hero of the War of 1812.
So some truth came out of it.
Yeah, I mean, not all great stories are false. I'm trying to focus on those that are, but you know, a lot of them are true. Most of the stories of Andrew Jackson that I've seen are true. I mean, I've got another presentation called something like 10 Things You Should Know About Andrew Jackson but Probably Don't. And I probably wouldn't fool a really informed audience. Howard probably knows all these things about Andrew Jackson, but little known things about him that are true. And there are some things that we imagine about him. There's some myths about Andrew Jackson, but that guy's a genuine hero. I don't think anybody else could have done what he did in the Creek War or in the Battle of New Orleans. And working on Jackson now has absolutely convinced me something that I thought, but now I think I know it. I mean, I'm confident. He was unquestionably head and shoulders above every other U.S. military commander in the War of 1812 for a whole host of reasons. And I have a little treatment on that in my next book about why he was such a great general. But anyway, there are genuine heroes of the war, but there's still a lot of mythology. And we love exciting stories, so we prefer to repeat them rather than examine them and find out that there are faults. And that sort of leads you to my second point. Myths often embody a kind of history that we find attractive. It creates an image of a self-image that we find appealing. And so we don't want to let go of it. And then finally, as a scholar, speaking from experience, it's a heck of a lot easier to repeat a good story, even if it's wrong, than it is to actually do research and challenge it. Now, I know when I wrote my first book, there were a couple of things that I repeated. I didn't even think about them. I thought, oh, this is a great story. I got to put this in my book. Well, when I started thinking about what's true and what's not true about the war, I thought, I don't think those things maybe are true. I don't find them credible, or they're not substantiated. So there are a lot of reasons that myths are real durable, and no single book is certainly going to put an end to the mythology of this war. All right, that's sort of what, by way of introduction. What I want to do next is talk about what we might call the top 10 myths of the War of 1812. I give this variations on this lecture a lot, and I change it almost every time. So it's not exactly the top 10 lecture or top 10 myths, or what are the top 10 myths today. Maybe tomorrow I'll have only 8 of those 10 will make my list tomorrow. It does vary over time. Let's start with the beginning and the end of the war. The war began with President Madison's proclamation on June 19, 1812, and ended with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814. Both of those statements are wrong. Presidents cannot declare war by proclamation. At least they're not supposed to. Only Congress can declare war. There are actually 2 ways Congress can do it. With an act, and that has to be signed by the president, and that's when it was done in 1812, or with a joint resolution, and that doesn't require a presidential signature, and I think that's the way we got involved in the Mexican War. We've actually only declared war in 5 of our wars: War of 1812, Mexican War, Spanish-American War, and the 2 World Wars. We haven't had a formal declaration of war since World War II. We don't do it that way anymore. We give the president authority to take action, and then he does if he's going to. So the reason people think Madison declared war is there's a widely reproduced image of his proclamation announcing that a state of war existed. But all you got to do is read the first sentence, and he says, as of yesterday, when Congress passed a bill that I signed into law, we have been at war with Great Britain. So it's people just looking at the proclamation without even reading it who believe that the war started by the president the day after it actually started by virtue of this act of Congress. The other common misconception is that the war ended on December 24, 1814, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Ghent, Belgium. And that perpetuates another myth that the Battle of New Orleans, which was fought 2 weeks later, was fought after the war was over. Not so. Now, if this had been a typical European treaty, yes. Europeans, when they negotiated treaties to end the war, they sent people who could commit the nation. And once they signed the treaty, it became binding, and both sides immediately sent out orders suspending hostilities. But our system doesn't work that way. Our treaties have to be ratified by the Senate, a 2/3 vote of the Senate, and by the President. Actually, that's the ratification process. He has to sign off on it. Now, the British had been burned on 3 different occasions by the United States. The Jay Treaty in 1794, a boundary convention in 1803, and then the Monroe-Pinckney Treaty of 1806, in which our guys in London had negotiated a treaty, and then either the Senate or the President insisted on changes. And the British feared that would happen again. So their fear in 1814 was if they agreed to suspend his hostilities, the treaty would reach the United States, and the United States would say, okay, we want these changes, and the British would be in the very awkward position of either restarting a war that they didn't really want to restart, or acceding to demands of the United States, unilateral demands to change the treaty. So the British insisted that hostilities would not be suspended until both sides had ratified. That's in Article 1 of the treaty. You don't have to get very deep into the treaty to see that. Now, London was not all that far from Ghent. The British Crown signed off on this treaty on the 27th of December. That was 3 days afterwards. The treaty didn't even reach the United States until February 11th. It was delivered to New York because of bad weather in the Chesapeake. Raced to the Capitol. The U.S. Senate unanimously approved it on February 16th, 1815. And when the president signed off on it later that day, he was not, of course, in the White House, which had been burned. He was in the Octagon House. When he signed off on it later that day, that completed the ratification process, and that ended the War of 1812. So that was February 16th, 1815. That would have been 5 weeks after the Battle of New Orleans. All right, another really tough one. The purpose of this war was to conquer and annex Canada. This is the widely held view north of the border in Canada, and it is held by a substantial number of Americans. But that's not why we went to war in 1812. We went to war to force the British to give up certain maritime practices. First of all, the Orders in Council, which regulated our trade with the continent, and secondly, the practice of impressment, which was the British practice of stopping American merchant vessels on the high seas and removing seamen. Supposedly they targeted only British tars, but in point of fact, between 1803 and 1812, we think between 6,000 and 9,000 bona fide American citizens were caught in the British dragnet, and thus conscripted into the Royal Navy. Now, how do we know these were the principal cause of the war? Because that's what the debate was about in Congress and in the country, in newspapers. That's what all the discussion was on at the time. And after we went to war, President James Madison sent out peace feelers and telling the British we'll call off this war if you'll make concessions on these two issues. But we could not challenge the British on the high seas. We could only challenge them by targeting their North American provinces, and so we invaded Canada. And this led to the myth that the war really wasn't about maritime issues. Those were just a blind, but its real purpose was to conquer and annex Canada. But that simply isn't true. Our two leading Westerners at the time, Henry Clay, said Canada was not the end, but the means to secure redress of injuries on the maritime issues. And Andrew Jackson, you can't imagine a more Western American, delivered a proclamation to his troops on the eve of war, and he doesn't say anything about Canada. He talks about how we've got to go to war to force the British to allow us to trade freely with Europe and also to put an end to the impressment of American seamen. So the evidence is really overwhelming that this war was fought over maritime issues. Now, the reason that's a hard sell today is nobody today understands neutral rights. You ask someone to talk about the finer points of neutral rights in the age of sail, their eyes are going to glaze over. They're not going to know what you're talking about. I don't think any nation has gone to war over neutral rights in at least a century. Maybe we did in 1917 in World War I. And before that, I think you have to go back to the War of 1812. So today, people don't understand the finer points of neutral rights in the age of sail, but everybody gets a land grab. That's not hard to explain. And it also fits into the larger history of American expansion. We were interested in acquiring Canada from 1775 till about 1900. And we were an aggressively expansionistic people up until about 1900. So this makes a very nice fit, this interpretation of the cause of the war, but it ain't so. Canada was the means, not the end. Now, what would we do if we conquered Canada? Who knows? The administration never made its position clear, I think because it wanted to keep all of its options open. The assumption was, if the British made concessions on the maritime issues, we'd give Canada back, but maybe we wouldn't have. And what would the British have done if we conquered Canada? Would they have made concessions on the maritime issues? I doubt it. I don't think anything would have compelled them to give up impressment, because that would have led to the collapse of their naval power and thus the loss of the Napoleonic Wars. They might have simply let us keep Canada. More likely, I think they would have waited until that war in Europe was over and taken those 50,000 veterans under the Great Wellington and said, cross the Atlantic and get Canada back for us. And I'll bet he could have done it. But we really don't know how this would have played out, whether we would have insisted on keeping it or whether the British would have retaken it. But it seems pretty clear to me that Canada was the means and not the end. And that is a really hard sell north of the border. Canadians don't have a diplomatic history of this war. It's not their diplomatic history. It's British diplomatic history, so they don't care about the Orders in Council and impressment. That doesn't concern them. That's Great Britain's foreign relations. What does concern them is these American troops invading Canada in 1812 and again in 1813 and then again in 1814. That's their idea of the War of 1812. And so they're just absolutely convinced that it was, this war was all about the United States seizing Canada. All right, number three, we have the conflict was a second war of American independence. It is often called a second war of American independence or our second war of independence, and in a broad sense, it was. It did vindicate American sovereignty, earn greater respect abroad from the great powers of Europe, including Great Britain. But I'm leery of using this term because it implies that the British were trying to recolonize us, that they were trying to seize American territory and add it to the British Empire in North America. And that's part of the mythology of the war, that we actually beat back a British attempt to recolonize the United States. Not so. Any territory the British were trying to seize in this war, they planned to use as a bargaining chip in the peace negotiations to secure greater security for Canada and their Indian allies to the north. And what is sort of odd about calling this an American War of Independence, there are 4 major belligerents in this war, and we're the only one whose independence was not at risk in this period. We could lose the War of 1812 and we would still remain an independent nation. But if the Indians lost this war, and they did, they would forfeit their independence. And that was the case. If Canada lost and we annexed Canada, there'd be no Canada. Canada would have lost its independence. And even Great Britain's independence was at risk in this era. Not from us, but rather from Napoleonic France. If France had succeeded in invading and conquering England, which Napoleon wanted to do, that would have put an end to British independence. So I find this term ironic because it looks to me like we're the only one of the major players in this war whose independence is not at stake here. All right, number 4, American and Canadian militia played a central role in the war. This is the hoary militia myth that we can depend on citizen soldiers to win our wars. It is actually stronger north of the border than it is south of the border. It originated during the war. There was a guy who later became the first Anglican bishop of Toronto named John Strawn, who sent a fundraising letter to England early in the war to support the families of those who served. And he explicitly says, we beat back the Americans with our militia. And that wasn't true. It was British regulars and their Indian allies who won those campaigns in 1812. But that was the beginning of this militia myth in Canada. And it persisted throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. Canadians love to think that they beat back this American invasion in 1812, 13, and 14 with their militia because that meant they didn't have to spend any money on defense after they became an independent nation. Why, if the Americans threaten them again, we'll just call out the militia and we'll beat them back again. So it became sort of a myth that both parties in Canada bought into because it meant they didn't have to shell out a lot of money for defense. The story was very popular in the United States, and as well because we wanted to believe that raw militia had defeated the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, the conquerors of Europe. And there was enough merit in this that 2 great Western battles, the Thames in Upper Canada, now Ontario, and New Orleans, there were a fair number of militia who engaged there. But most of the troops in both cases were actually volunteers or they were regulars. And militia mostly did support work in this war. You can't claim that they did most of the heavy lifting on either side in this war. So that's the militia myth. And then we have the notion that the Kentucky rifle was a game changer and a war winner, especially at New Orleans. There are still accounts that claim that Andrew Jackson won the Battle of New Orleans mainly because of Western riflemen, mostly from Kentucky or Tennessee. Well, first of all, there was no such thing as a Kentucky rifle then. It was the Pennsylvania rifle. They manufactured a few rifles in the West. I didn't think they manufactured any. But when I was in Tennessee a couple of years ago, one of the local guys there, Howard probably remembers this, he said, we've got some contemporary accounts of rifle manufacturers here in Tennessee. Not very many, but they did manufacture some. But the design was from Pennsylvania, and probably 99% of all rifles manufactured in the United States prior to 1812 originated in Pennsylvania. This became the Pennsylvania rifle because of a popular song called The Hunters of Kentucky in the 1820s, which promoted the notion that Kentucky riflemen had won the Battle of New Orleans. And not only did riflemen not win the battle, it was mostly artillery, but they were using what I would call Pennsylvania rifles. So riflemen do play a role in the major Western battles, but the basic shoulder arm, the basic weapon of issue, the weapon you would find in all the state and federal armories was the musket, the smooth-bore musket. And so that's the shoulder arm that did the heavy lifting in the small arms fire in this war, not the rifle. All right, number 6, Tecumseh was the most important Indian leader of the war. This is a view widely held on both sides of the border. I rank him as number 3. Number 1 is brother, the prophet, the drunk who had a religious revelation in 1805 and launched a revival movement that pulled a number of Western tribes into his camp. He created a religious movement, and it's only later, 1811 or so, that Tecumseh, his brother, sort of emerges and superimposes a military and political alliance on that religious movement. But without the prophet, I don't think Tecumseh would have gotten very far. And contemporaries, I think, understood that because until Tippecanoe, late 1811, you see references to Tecumseh by William Henry Harrison and others, and typically they refer to him as the prophet's brother. They don't name him by name. The prophet is the leading player in the Northwest Indian War, really until Tippecanoe. And then I think after Tippecanoe in November of 1811, Tecumseh emerges, but his star doesn't burn brightly for very long because he's killed at the Thames in October of 1813, which is less than 2 years later. So I think the prophet looms larger in that Western Indian War, and there's also a Canadian Indian in the overall war, a guy named John Norton, who was part Cherokee and part Scottish, and became a Mohawk leader. He's in almost all the battles on the Niagara frontier, which is a more important theater of operations, and I think he looms much larger than Tecumseh. So it looks to me like Tecumseh has to take a backseat to those guys, but nevertheless, we have elevated Tecumseh to the top in the mythology of the war. Next we have the naval myths. There are 4 principal ones. 1 is ours and 3 are British. And the statement that embodies those myths is American heavy frigates were ships of the line in disguise, relied on picked crews that were heavily British, and their victories enabled the United States to win the war at sea. Now the first 3 statements in that declarative statement are part of the British mythology on the war. We won the first 3 frigate victories, our frigates against their frigates, in this war. And British naval captains and their defenders tried to explain this away. So they claim that our frigates were actually battleships, ships of the line in disguise. In point of fact, they fit the definition of frigates, a single covered deck. They were frigates, but they were super frigates. They were much bigger, much more powerful, much more heavily armed, had much bigger crews than the more conventional 18-gun frigates that the British had. Ours were 24-gun, or 24-pounders. They had bigger guns as well as more guns. It's no disgrace for a light frigate to be defeated by a heavy frigate, but the British were not willing to settle for that, so they insisted that our frigates were really ships of the line in disguise, which is simply not true. If it were true, what does that say about a British naval captain who can't figure out the difference between a frigate and a battleship on the high seas? Yeah, it probably needs to go back to school. All right. Myth number 2, the British naval captains who lost our frigates claimed that our crews were picked. In other words, naval captains said, you're the best tars I know, the best seaman I know, I want you on my ship. That didn't work that way at all. In point of fact, the Navy typically took a backseat to privateers. Privateering service was much more attractive to most tars. It was a shorter tour of duty, simply the length of the cruise, usually about 3 months rather than a year. There was the possibility of big prize money, and also they didn't maintain discipline with the cat of nine tails. So working conditions were a lot better. And later in the war, the U.S. Navy had to compete with the U.S. Army because by the end of the war, the U.S. Army was offering an incredible enlistment bounty. $124 in cash, 320 acres of land. Now, given that the typical unskilled labor in those days earned $10 to $20 a month, I reckon based on the minimum wage today, that's about 30 grand. That was a pretty handsome bounty. So the Navy did not have picked crews. The British also maintained that the American Navy was heavily crewed by British tars. And that helped them explain away their defeats. But that's not true. After the Chesapeake in 1807, the U.S. Navy prohibited employing British seamen on board our ships. And even though some were employed, virtually, I think almost all of those resigned from the Navy in 1812 because they didn't want to fight against the fatherland or the motherland, and they knew if they were caught and exposed, they would be hanged as traitors. Theodore Roosevelt, one of our great naval historians of the war, reckoned that no U.S. warship had more than 10% of a crew. It was British, and I think that's high. I think probably none of them were above 5%. The only sort of murky area here is what about Irishmen, who were technically British subjects? If you had Irish tars, they might have been in American service for 20 years. Well, technically the British might claim they're British, but they're really de facto American citizens, even though they've never become naturalized, just because they've been part of the United States for so long. All right, those are the three British myths. The American myth is because we won a number of single-ship duels on the high seas, we beat the British in the war at sea. That's not true for a variety of reasons. Number one, you look at all the naval duels in the war, and the British gave about as good as they got. It's fairly equal. Number two, none of these duels had any strategic importance. They had no impact on the course of the war. The two preeminent uses of naval power in this war were both British. The British used their Navy to supply their troops in Canada. That was a logistical function, absolutely critical. And number two, they blockaded the Atlantic coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast. That played a critical role in seizing up the American economy and leading to the insolvency of the national government, so that in November of 1814, the U.S. government, for the only time since Hamilton put our financial house in order in the early 1790s, the U.S. government defaulted on the national debt. So those were the two preeminent uses of naval power. These single-ship naval duels, which made the reputation of like the USS Constitution. As much as I admire and revere the Constitution, these naval duels didn't amount to a hill of beans. They had no impact on the course of the war. Okay, number 8. If the British had defeated Andrew Jackson in the Battle of New Orleans, they planned to sack the city and retain Louisiana after the war. These are two myths that we have embraced because they magnify the importance of the Battle of New Orleans. And I think we want to think the victory had more significance than it did. So the first is the booty and beauty myth. The notion that the British sign and countersign the night before the war were beauty and booty, and that meant the British were going to sack the city. There is absolutely no evidence that they were going to do that. And the guy who actually originated the myth was a slacker. He was an American who claimed he had hurt his arm, so he couldn't come to Jackson's front line during the main battle. He was busy in New Orleans writing out this claim, which he later claimed he got from British prisoners of war, that was the sign and countersign. But no evidence that that was true. The British denied it, and the British were really good at controlling their men during an occupation. There was virtually no looting when they occupied Washington, D.C. In fact, one of the few pieces of private property they destroyed was the administration newspaper, the Washington National Intelligencer, and when that newspaper resumed publication, it said the looting in town was not done by the British, but rather by local miscreants who hung around when everybody else left. So I have no doubt that the British would have kept a tight hold on their troops if they had occupied New Orleans. Second part of the myth is that if they had retained Louisiana, they would have effectively repudiated the Treaty of Ghent and never given Louisiana back. Absolutely no evidence to support that. And the key is to look at the British diplomatic documents and what British government officials are saying about the Gulf Coast campaign during the peace negotiations. They're not saying anything. It's like they sent that expedition out and it's not even on their radar. It's just like not something that it is playing any role in their thinking. And in fact, the British Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, at one point said, New Orleans is the most unhealthy place in America. The British were war-weary when the War of 1812 began. They'd been at war with France for nearly 20 years. They were even more war-weary by late 1814. They just wanted to end this war. And the chances that they would have held on to territory that would, in all likelihood, have led to a renewal of the war, zero. I don't think there's any chance. Part of the myth, part of the reason there is a myth, is that the British commander, Packingham, did have orders to set up a government of occupation if the British held territory. And they were going to use it as a bargaining chip in the negotiations. But that doesn't mean they were going to keep it after the war was over. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. All right, number 8, Federalist opposition encouraged the enemy and prolonged the war. This war was bitterly opposed by the Federalist Party. We Americans like to think World War II is our model for our wars. Everybody rallies to the flag. And when we look at the War of 1812 and we see extreme and decided party opposition, we get very uncomfortable and think, oh, that sure isn't our model. But in fact, that is the norm. You look at all of our major wars, with one or two exceptions, and we've had significant and sizable opposition. The Revolution, the quasi-war against France in the late 1790s, War of 1812, Mexican War, Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I, and every war since World War II. There's been some opposition and pretty decided in recent years. So the War of 1812 was vigorously opposed by the Federalist Party. Boy, get used to it. That's the norm in American history. It is estimated today if we go to war, probably 25% of the American people from day one are going to oppose it. Unless we're invaded. And I don't think that's going to happen from Canada or Mexico. Maybe Mexico's already invaded, I'm not sure. I don't think the Federalist opposition actually prolonged war. I think Federalist opposition in the United States and Whig opposition in Great Britain shortened the war, because that made both governments more amenable to peace. If each government had had a lot more support for its war program, well, maybe the war would have lasted longer. So I would argue that it actually shortened the war. And finally, number 10, with a more focused strategy, the United States could have conquered Canada, but it still won the war. Well, there are two issues here. That if we'd only had a more focused strategy concentrated against Montreal and Quebec, rather than fritting away our resources out west, we would have conquered Canada. I don't think so. I don't think there was any way the United States was going to conquer Canada in 1812 for three reasons. Number one, our own military establishment was in terrible condition. Senior officers were awful. The men were mostly raw recruits. I don't think that military establishment was up to the job. Number two, we faced a formidable foe. British regulars, about 5,000 of them, and their Indian allies. Indian allies were a great asset on the battlefield. They were great scouts, great trackers, great skirmishers, and sometimes the very presence of an Indian force on a battlefield could panic an enemy force, because they didn't want to be captured by the Indians and tortured to death. Now, they weren't always a dependable ally. There were times when Indians were very much adverse to casualties, and there were times when you would see a mixed force marching into war, and the white soldiers turn around, and the Indians have all disappeared, because they just got this sense this battle wasn't going to go well, and so they skedaddled. But we faced a very formidable enemy. And the third problem was logistical. Both sides found, when they took the offensive in this war, waging war in the North American wilderness created insuperable logistical challenges. How do you move your men through the wilderness? How do you get supplies to them? How do you reinforce them? Very, very difficult to wage offensive warfare in the North American wilderness. And that explains why we made little headway in 1812 and 1813 when we were on the offensive. And even when the British, who had a pretty well-oiled machine, were on the offensive in 1814 and 1815, they were defeated. The three biggest offensives of the war, when we targeted Montreal in 1813 and when the British targeted Plattsburgh in 1814 and New Orleans in 1815, all three of those offensives failed because it was just so difficult to wage offensive warfare. All right, final myth. It deals with who won the war. There's an old saw that everybody's happy with the outcome of this war. The Americans are happy because they think they won. The Canadians are happier because they know they won. And the British are happiest of all because they've forgotten all about it. Except for ignoring the Indians, who were the big losers. That's not a bad assessment. Now, conventional wisdom holds that the war ended in a draw because it ended in a draw on the battlefield. Neither side was able to make much headway. And the Treaty of Ghent reflected that by restoring the status quo antebellum. Any conquered territory was restored. And by the way, I'm sure the British would have restored Louisiana if they'd conquered it, just like they restored Mackinac Island, Prairie du Chien, Fort Niagara, 100 miles of the Maine coast, and Cumberland Island on the Georgia coast. Louisiana, but it would have been returned along with that territory. Anyway, my own take is that the United States lost the war. Because we went to war to force the British to give up certain maritime practices. Those issues were not even mentioned in the peace treaty. Now, the argument is, yeah, but the Napoleonic Wars were over, and so the British were no longer encroaching on our rights. Well, that's true. But the key to me is there was nothing in that peace treaty which would have prevented the British from resuming those practices if, indeed, there had been a renewal of the European War. I think the British could have resumed those practices because there would have been nothing to prevent them from doing so. So my argument is the notion that the war even ended in a draw is probably not true. Certainly the notion that we won the war is just plain false. I think the biggest claim you can make, the best claim you can make for the United States is that this war ended in a draw. That's not my view, but that's a credible position. Okay, those are my myths of the War of 1812. Now, I'm happy to take your challenges. Tell me if I've got anything wrong. If you have any myths you think deserve to be mentioned, any questions or comments, this is my chance to learn from you. Yes, sir. Here. Say that again?
Why has it always been the War of 1812? Why didn't someone better?
Oh boy, that's a great point, Gary. I tracked down the first use of this name, and it's in a newspaper in New York in September of 1812, 3 days after the declaration of war. There's a headline that says something like "Summary of the War of 1812." And that did not, however, become the norm until the late 1840s and early 1850s. It was known during the contest simply as the war, or maybe the British War. After the war, it became the British War, our Second War with Great Britain, or most commonly the late war, or the recent war. Well, that wasn't going to work once we got involved in the Mexican War. And you look at book titles, and people start shifting and calling it the War of 1812 in the late 1840s. And by the 1850s, that has become the accepted title. But it is really unfortunate. If we only called it the British War of 1812, at least my students would know who we fought. So it's not a very descriptive war. I think it's the only war in history known by a date, at least by a year. There's the Yom Kippur War, known by some reference to a calendar, but I can't think of any other war. Certainly there aren't any other American wars that we know by a year, are there?
Was it ever known popularly as Mr. Madison's War?
That did not catch on. The Federalists tried to hang that on the Republicans early in the war. A guy named John Lowell Jr. published a pamphlet, Mr. Madison's War, but it didn't catch on. And I think the reason it didn't catch on is Madison was not a strong war leader. So, and I think people understood it. Even Republicans were saying that to one another. If you look in my first book, I've got a number of quotes from Republicans saying, "Oh God, this guy just isn't right for the storms of war." He was a nice guy and a great scholar, and he was great at writing diplomatic treatises that outlined international law, but he was not a strong war leader. Now, the upside of that is he didn't encroach on the civil rights of his domestic opponents. And that's something that war leaders find it very difficult not to do, you know, to try to crush their domestic foes in time of crisis. Yes?
You told about the number of sailors that was taken on American ships. Is there any record of what happened to them eventually? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. You go.
Eventually.
Okay, what happened to seamen who were impressed in the British service? The British practice was to, American captains whose seamen were impressed had to report to the U.S. government. The U.S. government would see if there's evidence that this was an American citizen, someone born in the U.S. If it was, they'd send it to London. If officials in London found the evidence credible, they would order the man released. But that was a process that took years. And in the meantime, you're subject to all the horrors of Royal Navy discipline into a war that isn't your own. And the British Royal Navy rule was, if you accepted the bounty at any time in your service, you could accept your pay, but if you accepted the king's shilling, as it was called, or the king's crown, the bounty, you were now considered a volunteer, and it didn't matter how you actually came into the service. Now, all of the Americans impressed in the 1790s were released during the Peace of Amiens when the Royal Navy demobilized, 1802, 1803. And then they resumed the practice, and at the beginning of the War of 1812, the British allowed those people who claimed to be Americans on their ships to beg off of service, but they treated them as POWs. One of the oddities of this war is that both sides treated seamen as combatants, even if they were on merchant vessels. And I think that was because potentially, if you could serve on a merchant vessel, you were going to be equally effective on a warship, although you might not know how to man the cannons. So that's one of the oddities of the war. All seamen are treated as combatants and thus POWs if they're taken. Yes, follow-up?
Did England own any other territory in the United States?
In North America?
In North America.
Okay, British North American territories were
1812.
British North American territories in 1812, and the correct term is probably British North America, although everyone called those 7 or 8 or 9 provinces to the north of us Canada. So that term was in use. Those were Great Britain's North American territories. It's what we think of as Canada today. Although Newfoundland did not actually become part of Canada until 1949. It was a separate British province. Yes, sir?
Two very quick ones. Were these myths more than actual facts? The burning of Washington, D.C., was that actually retaliatory for the burning or the sacking of York or Toronto? And is it a myth or is it a fact that there were American troops that refused to cross the border into Canada?
Okay. First question is, why did the British burn the public buildings in Washington, D.C.? I know we use it as shorthand. We say they burned Washington, but they didn't. To the best of my knowledge, this wasn't for retaliation for York. Don Graves tried to trace this, the Canadian historian, and his conclusion is we're really not sure why they did it. Public buildings were probably legitimate targets in a military campaign. But what about civilian government buildings? Well, that was a gray area. My own take is the British were probably justified under international law in burning those buildings. But they did take some heat for doing it. I doubt if it was for York. We had burned a lot of other things in Canada since York. The Governor General of Canada, Sir George Prevost, later asked Admiral Cockburn in the Chesapeake to retaliate, and conventional wisdom is that that's why Ross burned the public buildings, but it's not clear if he even got that report from Admiral Cochrane. So we're not quite sure why those buildings were burned, but I don't think it was in retaliation for York, and if it was, they should have burned the whole city, because we burned a lot of private buildings in York. Now, the second question was?
Is it a fact that there were American troops that refused to go into Canada on the invasions?
There were a number of American troops, especially in the East, who refused to leave U.S. territory. The most celebrated case occurred in October of 1812 when 1,000 regulars crossed the Niagara frontier, established a strong position on Queenston Heights, and we tried to get the New York militia, who were good Democrats who supported the war, to cross over, and they wouldn't. And they stood on their constitutional right not to serve outside of U.S. territory. But I don't think that was the real reason. The real reason is they could hear the Indian war whoops on the other side. They could hear the gunfire, and the dead and wounded were being paraded across in front of them as they were brought across the river. And I can just imagine these citizen soldiers sort of, I ain't going over there. No, sir. They're shooting people over there. To put it another way, if there had been no resistance on the Niagara frontier, I think they gladly would have crossed over and taken part in the occupation. But that did happen. It was far less common in the West. There were even some Westerners who refused to cross, but mostly from Ohio and Kentucky. Those were where most of the militia in the West were from. They had no compunctions about crossing the border. Further east, New York, Vermont, yes, much more of a problem.